Alberta Premier Danielle Smith won her seat by winning the by-election in Brooks Medicine Hat on Tuesday night. She got around 54% of the vote. Now, to talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, Smith won quite handily. Who was her nearest competitor?
Her nearest competitor was Gwendolyn Dirk with the NDP, followed by Barry Morishita with the Alberta Party leader, actually. And then there were two independence candidates, I should say, who sort of rounded out the group. And as you say, a fairly substantial victory, 54% of the vote. And I think Dirk came in around 26 and Morishita around 16% of the vote. People are sort of already in the moments after this reading a lot into this, I think, saying that, oh, this wasn't a super commanding victory for Smith. 40-odd% of the voters in that riding didn't vote for her. And I'm not sure that sort of analysis is the right one. She won, and that's really what matters for her purposes. But I think it does show, not to overstate it at all, that things are looking pretty competitive in Alberta right now. That's a pretty good showing for the Alberta Party, which doesn't have a seat in the legislature, has not made very much of a splash for the last couple of years, and the NDP reasonably competitive as well in a riding that should have been a pretty straightforward United Conservative victory. So a really interesting by-election, but of course the relevant bit of news is that Danielle Smith will be taking her seat in the legislature when it returns on, I believe it's November 29th.
Now, it appears as though voter turnout was quite low, too. Was it around 30%? Why do you think that was?
Yeah, I mean, that's not unusual, I don't think, for by-elections. It's frankly, voter turnout's a problem across all elections at all levels of government. So I think that was probably a large part of it. Who knows? Maybe people were sitting at home watching the U.S. midterm election stuff instead of voting in a by-election. But, I think there's a couple other things happening there. The sense that Smith was almost certainly going to win probably kept some United Conservative voters at home. I think probably some not all that much love for the New Democrats in small town in rural Alberta. Not that Medicine Hat's a super small town these days, but I think that probably kept some people at home. But I think at the end of the day, this is actually just part of a pretty broad trend of people not really showing up in all that great of numbers for by-elections.
What do you think this will really mean for the people of Brooks Medicine Hat now that they've got their premiers, their MLA here, which is pretty cool? Are they going to see maybe some more capital projects thrown their way, especially as we lead up to next May's provincial election?
Well, there certainly has been some talk recently about sort of flinging money around the province, frankly, with the surplus. Obviously an election year, and we're going to see a lot of that spending. And I would expect that to be spread out. A lot of it is probably going to go to Calgary because that's a major battleground, the same as sort of the donut of suburban areas around Edmonton. But I see no reason why that money wouldn't also flow to other parts of the province. It will be interesting, of course, having a leader and a premier as your representative is a bit of a catch-22 because, of course, they have concerns sort of well beyond what constituents are talking about. So in that sense, might not be the most perfect situation in the world for people in Brooks Medicine Hat. On the other hand, they theoretically have a direct line to the most powerful politician in the province. So a bit of both happening there, I think, and it'll be interesting to see how much time Smith chooses to spend there in the weeks ahead because, of course, she doesn't live in the riding, but now has to represent them. So it'll be interesting to see. That's something I'm going to watch because I'm always fascinated about where politicians choose to run for their seats.
Now, some interesting polling suggests that the UCP may have its work cut out for it leading up to next May's provincial election, Tyler. The numbers show that the NDP is actually leading in Alberta right now in different ridings.
That's right. Yeah. So the NDP is at 47% compared to 38% for the UCP. So this is pretty recent polling that asked, if the election was held today in sort of mid-October or late October when the polling was done, who would you vote for? And 47% saying the New Democrats. And that lead holds across the province more or less. In Edmonton, it's 57% for the NDP to 31% for the United Conservatives. And in Calgary, it's 46% for the NDP versus 40% for the United Conservatives. The place where it doesn't hold true is in the sort of other category, rural and small town Alberta, where the UCP is up 44 to 36. But the thing to note here is that these numbers have shifted, pretty dramatically since 2019. The UCP was at 55% across the province in 2019 compared to the NDP at 33%. And in rural and small town Alberta, the UCP was at 67% and the NDP at 31%. So this does, I think, suggest that there is some movement in what people are thinking about where they're considering casting their ballots in the next election. And the sort of received wisdom in political circles is that there are three constituencies in Alberta. There's Edmonton, there's Calgary, and there's the rest. And in order to form government, you need to win two of those. And at present, the New Democrats are up in two of those. So for the United Conservatives looking at that, they need to be asking themselves, what can they do to not widen that gap necessarily in rural and small town Alberta, but narrow that gap in Calgary and Edmonton. So those are some of the questions that I'm certain the people around Smith are spending a lot of time thinking about right now.
Now, do you think some of the polling has to do with the Kenney effect? I mean, Kenney on his way out. Now we have a new premier, and she hasn't really had a chance to get her feet wet yet and really bring forth a lot of her policies and her vision as we lead up to the next election?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit of that. And I think it's also probably a bit of a hangover from the campaign. I think I said a few weeks ago that when I was reporting on the campaign, people said one of the reasons that Danielle Smith did so well was because she was running to be the leader of a Conservative party, not necessarily the leader of a province. And the things that she talked about were things that really resonated with the United Conservative Party membership. That was talking about COVID-19 policies. That was talking about the Alberta Sovereignty Act and fighting with Ottawa. Whereas some of the research on what Albertans wanted to talk about were kind of some different things like inflation and affordability, the future of the oil and gas sector and the economy, that sort of stuff. So the point I'm slowly getting around to making is there's a lot of ground, a lot of areas where Danielle Smith can come up with policy, make announcements, talk about these things, shift some of the conversation perhaps away from these more controversial things, talk about some of the bread and butter issues that Albertans want to hear about. And I have no doubt that that's what certainly some of her advisors are telling her right now. And so you're totally right. There hasn't been many policy announcements. So I think we're looking still a little bit at a hangover from the leadership race. And to some extent, Danielle Smith's government is an unknown quantity to Albertans and reporters, frankly, at this moment, whereas Rachel Notley is really, really well known. She's been around for a while. Everyone knows what she stands for. So certainly I think, it's very, very early days. I don't think we need to read, too much into some of these polling numbers.
Tyler, a former NDP MLA has pleaded guilty to a charge of breaching the Health Information Act when he allegedly used a computer to force his way into the vaccine records program. Can you explain a little bit more?
Sure. So Thomas Dang was an Edmonton New Democrat, and when the vaccine portal was first announced, where you could get your little certificate and vaccine information, he sort of ran a computer program that used Jason Kenney's date of birth and the date of his vaccination to sort of force entry to this records portal. And it basically exposed a security flaw in the portal. And so, some have argued that this was sort of a white knight hacking operation. But either way, he was charged. He has pleaded guilty to a Health Information Act charge. It's not a criminal charge. And so the defense and the Crown are in discussions, I guess, about what the penalty is going to be. The Crown, I think, is asking for a $10,000 fine, and the defense is asking for a $4,000 fine. But either way, a bit of a sideshow drama here that, and it's notable, the United Conservatives are still trying to make this an issue for Rachel Notley, demanding she say, what she knew and when and that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to see if this story sort of lingers around at all in political circles.
It appears for the time being that protections against coal mining remain in place here in the province. Now that's according to our province's new energy minister, Peter Guthrie.
Yeah, so this was announced at, I believe, a hydrogen announcement this week. Of course, this was a big drama a little while back when the 1976 moratorium on coal mining and exploration on the eastern slopes of the Rockies was abolished, I guess, and led to quite a significant backlash, particularly from small town Alberta, sort of down your way, as people were concerned about the ways that coal mining might affect water systems and things like that. So under Jason Kenney, the government backtracked. Sonia Savage, then the energy minister, sort of issued an order that reestablished protections, and then there was going to be further sort of study on the issue. Now, in some comments recently, Danielle Smith had mused about sort of reopening the discussion about potential coal exploration, and this, of course, raised a few eyebrows among people who are concerned about this. But Peter Guthrie, as you say, confirmed that this order remains in place. So for the time being, the coal policy is unchanged. Could it change? I think that's possible. Public consultations likely would be a part of that sort of thing. But a little bit of a development on a file that is very much of interest in parts of the province, for sure.
Now, Tyler, let's make our way to Ottawa for just a moment here. And Alberta's up for discussion at the Commission looking into the Liberal government's use of the Emergencies Act last February during the Freedom Convoy. In particular, they'll be discussing what transpired at the Coutts border crossing not far from here in Lethbridge. And Coutts Mayor Jim Willett will be taking the stand.
And, you know, the most interesting thing that's come out so far is that he was text messaging Rajan Sawhney, who was then the transportation minister, I think, basically saying that, I think that the premier's ignoring what he called domestic terrorists. So, that was sort of a series of text messages that were tabled to the commission, which is looking into, basically three things: Ottawa, the Ambassador Bridge, and the Coutts border crossing. So I think we're probably going to get a little bit of a look behind the curtain in the days ahead on what the government knew, what people were talking about and thinking regarding the Coutts border protests. So, not wildly explosive news sort of at this hour, shall we say, but something to keep an eye on because, of course, there is very much an Alberta angle on all of that. And, court cases happening down in Lethbridge on that, 4 of them pretty serious criminal charges. So it'll be interesting to see what information comes out there as the commission continues its work.
The Alberta government, along with the federal government, are putting up hundreds of millions of dollars towards one of the world's largest hydrogen facilities that'll be in operation in 2024 in Northeast Edmonton. Tyler, is this a sign of an energy transition, perhaps?
I think it's a sign that there is some agreement, believe it or not, between the Alberta government and the federal government that we need to be looking at diversified revenue sources and diversified energy sources. And one of those prospects for Canada at this point is hydrogen. And so there seems to be some agreement on that, and that Alberta is sort of poised to be a world leader on the hydrogen front. So they're big numbers. I've got them in front of me here. They are $300 million from the federal government for construction, and then upon completion, the Alberta government is going to issue $161 million in grant funding for the sort of operation of that plant, and it's going to create, I think, about 2,500 construction jobs and I think 30 permanent jobs once it's all said and done. So I think it's a way to look at, you can look at it in terms of energy, which is obviously important, but also, they're not always flinging mud at each other. Sometimes they can stand in a room and get along.
Now, Premier Danielle Smith has been discussing the potential of building a pipeline to the port in Churchill, Manitoba, but the plan has been met with a little bit of skepticism.
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, it's a challenging construction environment for starters, as anyone who's watched the ongoing thing about the railroad sort of sinking into the bog on its way up to Churchill knows. So a bit of a complicated one there. And what Danielle Smith did a couple weeks ago was write to Premier Scott Moe and Manitoba Premier Heather Stevenson and say, hey, we should get together to discuss this. Now, Manitoba seems a little bit unenthusiastic about this, shall we say, basically arguing that there are other priorities in Manitoba right now, and that while it's understandable that Alberta wants another sort of point of export for its oil and gas products, that there's an energy crisis in the world, might have some demand for Alberta oil, that this is just simply not the same sort of level of priority for Manitoba. Of course, such a project would not just be an Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba thing. There's federal regulatory stuff that would need to happen there. But it'll be interesting to see how that one pans out and whether or not that becomes a viable project in the years ahead, or if there'll be more enthusiasm from other jurisdictions' politicians.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.